My husband told me he needed space on weekends. That time with his ex helped him reset emotionally. I nodded like that made sense, like that didn't sound like absolute madness from a man who once said I was his forever. Friday night, he left the house wearing the aftershave I bought him, telling me not to wait up because Daisy likes to talk late into the evening. I spent that night sitting in the kitchen, staring at the flickering glow of our pendant light, wondering when I stopped being enough. The next morning, I made eggs I couldn't taste and stared out the window while he texted her from across the table. Before I continue narrating the story of Paige Hart, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Daisy had a laugh that Colton once described as infectious, the kind that got stuck in your head like a song you didn't ask to hear. Lately, I heard that laugh more often than my own name. He'd play her voice notes with the casual familiarity of someone sharing a podcast, then glance at me like I should be amused. I'd smile tight-lipped, spooning yogurt into bowls while imagining chucking his phone into the garbage disposal. It had become a strange Sunday ritual, his ex-wife's laugh echoing through our kitchen while he buttered toast. 3 months into their rekindled friendship, he stopped asking if I minded when he saw her. That question used to come paired with apologies and long explanations I didn't ask for. Then, slowly it faded, replaced with the assumption that I'd simply accept it. He'd mutter things like, "You know how she gets," and "She really needed to talk." I stopped replying, mostly because I didn't trust myself to speak without setting something on fire. The first time I found her earring in our guest bathroom, I stared at it like it was a snake. Gold hoop, small, delicate, the kind of jewelry I don't wear because I'm allergic to lies. Colton claimed she must have dropped it when she came by briefly to borrow a book. I don't know what book she needed from our guest bathroom, but I didn't ask. I flushed the earring down the toilet and scrubbed the sink until it sparkled like nothing had ever happened. By October, Colton's wardrobe had quietly evolved into something curated. Tailored jackets, Italian leather boots, scarves he used to mock as, quote, pretentious. His appearance became crisp on weekends, sharper than the suits he wore to work. I noticed because the man I married used to dress like a well-loved sweatshirt on Sundays. Now he looked like he was auditioning for a magazine spread titled Brooding but Artistic. Our bedroom became a quiet war zone. No fights, just absence, the kind that hangs heavy in the air like humidity before a storm. He stopped sleeping in completely, claiming insomnia, then eventually relocated to the guest room under the pretense of giving me space. The irony made me want to laugh, but nothing about our life was funny anymore. I fell asleep to the sound of his voice in the hallway, whispering to Daisy like she was a secret he cherished. On the night of our anniversary, he left a bottle of red wine and a note that said, "Rain check. Daisy's gallery opening needs my support." I drank the wine alone, wearing the dress I'd picked weeks in advance, while our dinner reservations went unclaimed. I watched the candle melt slowly into wax puddles and wondered when I became the backup plan in my own marriage. His text at midnight read, "Hope you had a good night. Can't wait to celebrate properly soon." I didn't reply. I started going on long walks pretending they were for exercise, but really, I needed to be in motion to avoid collapsing under the weight of humiliation. Richmond's leafy streets became my sanctuary, the crunch of autumn under my boots grounding me when everything else felt like quicksand. Sometimes I'd pass couples holding hands and feel an ache so sharp it made my fingers twitch. Other times I imagined a different life, one where I left without telling him and didn't look back. It was a fantasy then, just a daydream I let myself entertain in moments of unbearable clarity. The London offer had been sitting in my inbox for weeks, unopened but loud, a blinking lighthouse in the fog of my indecision. My boss had called 3 times, each more patient than the last, reminding me it was a promotion, not an exile. It would mean leaving Colton, our townhouse, the life I'd tried so hard to make perfect. It would mean choosing myself over a man who didn't notice he was losing me piece by piece. I hadn't said yes yet, but I hadn't deleted the email either. Colton once told me I was his center, the calm in his storm. Now, I felt like his placeholder, the woman who kept his laundry clean while he emotionally cohabited with someone else. He talked about Daisy like she was a lost masterpiece, misunderstood and tragic, someone he needed to protect. I wasn't interested in being anyone's shelter anymore. I wanted to be the storm. That Sunday, he left wearing the scarf I gave him for our second anniversary. The one he said made him feel like an author in a French film. I stood at the window, watching his car disappear down the road, and for the first time, I didn't feel like chasing him. Instead, I opened my laptop, clicked the email with the subject line, European Division Director Role, Final Consideration, and hit reply. I typed, I'm ready. Packing was easier than I expected. Clothes, essentials, laptop, the pearls, from my grandmother. I'd refused to lend Colton when he said Daisy needed something classic for a gallery event. I left the framed photo of our wedding on the mantel like a tombstone. The note I wrote him was simple. If you can't trust me to trust you, maybe we shouldn't be together. So I trusted you and chose to go. When he texted, what are you doing this weekend? I replied with a selfie from Heathrow, Gate 18, London-bound boarding pass in hand. His response was a single word. Wait, but the plane was already taxiing, and I didn't want to be the woman who stayed one more minute waiting for someone to realize she was worth staying for. The seatbelt sign dinged. I closed my eyes, breathed deeply, and exhaled the last 4 years of my life. London greeted me like it had been expecting me all along. Gray skies, soft drizzle, the scent of roasted chestnuts wafting from a street cart. The cab ride to my temporary flat in Shoreditch was quiet. The driver offering polite conversation I declined with a smile. My mind buzzed with the weight of the decision I'd made. Not because I doubted it, but because I couldn't believe I'd finally followed through. The key turned easily in the lock of the apartment. A clean, modern space, with tall windows and wide, empty walls waiting to be claimed. I didn't cry, not even when I dropped my bags and sank onto the unfamiliar couch, alone but not lonely. Monday came fast, and with it the routine I hadn't realized I was desperate for. The office was a sleek, open-concept building, filled with people who only knew me as Paige from London HQ. No one looked at me with pity. No one whispered behind my back about Colton or Daisy. I was just a director with a brilliant pitch deck and a 3-month roadmap that made even the skeptics raise eyebrows. It felt like rebirth. By the end of the week, I'd learned everyone's names, settled into my corner desk, and found the cafe that made cappuccinos exactly the way I liked them. Dry foam, extra cinnamon. On Thursday, my assistant Isla handed me a glossy binder of campaign briefs and said, "We're lucky to have you." I smiled, the kind of genuine, full-face smile I hadn't worn since before Daisy returned to London. Every time I thought about Richmond, it felt farther away, like a place I'd visited once and decided not to return to. I didn't miss the house. I missed who I was before I started questioning my own reality. The flat was still bare, but I'd started leaving traces of myself around. Books on the table, a yellow throw on the couch, a photo of my mother beside the kettle. Friday night, I walked past a gallery opening and paused outside the window, watching silhouettes drift past art I didn't recognize. I didn't go in. Not because I didn't belong, but because I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. That was new. Saturday brought rain, the kind that felt intentional, like the sky knew I needed an excuse to stay in. I spent the day in a sweatshirt, editing presentation slides, and playing soft jazz from my laptop. The quiet didn't feel like absence. It felt like space. By evening, I found myself walking barefoot across the hardwood floor, glass of wine in hand, humming without realizing. I felt more like myself than I had in years. It took Colton 4 days to call. Not text, not email. Call, like we were still something. I let it ring the first time. The second time, I answered. His voice cracked when he said my name. "Paige, what are you doing?" he asked, like I'd stolen something that belonged to him. "Living," I said, and meant it. He told me Daisy hadn't answered his texts in 3 days, like I was supposed to care. I reminded him I was not his therapist, nor his emotional backup plan. He didn't respond right away, and the silence on the line felt louder than anything he could have said. "You're really not coming back?" he finally asked. No, I answered. Because I already left. I ended the call before he could respond, dropped the phone on the couch, and stared at the ceiling until the silence became peace again. That was the last time I heard his voice. 2 weeks passed. The London team tripled productivity projections under my lead, and headquarters emailed congratulations. I found a permanent flat with exposed brick, a clawfoot tub, and a view of a narrow street lined with flower boxes. When I signed the lease, the agent asked if I needed help moving in. I told her no, I'd left everything I didn't need behind. Richmond only existed now in stories people told me about themselves. I didn't tell them mine. There was no reason to explain why I flinched when someone said anniversary, or why I declined every Sunday brunch invitation. They wouldn't understand that Sundays used to smell like betrayal and now smelled like fresh scones and freedom. I liked it better that way. Then came the letter. Not an email or a voicemail. A real letter, handwritten in the uneven scrawl I recognized instantly. Colton. It was postmarked from a different address, not the Richmond house, but a flat in Clapham. He'd moved, probably after I sold the house, though he never asked me what would happen to it. I debated opening it. For 2 days it sat on my bookshelf like a dormant volcano. On the third night, I poured a glass of wine and slit the envelope with the letter opener my mother gave me when I moved out. Inside were 3 pages of apologies, none of which used the word affair. He talked about confusion, misplaced priorities, nostalgia. He said he missed me. There was a line near the end that made me sit down. I thought I was doing the right thing by keeping you both. I didn't realize I was losing you in the process. I folded the letter and set it beside the window. Not in the trash, not in the fire. Just somewhere I could see it and remind myself what it took to finally leave. Regret is not the same as change. Colton's letter stayed on my windowsill for exactly 7 days before I tucked it into a drawer I rarely opened. I didn't respond, not because I hadn't forgiven him, but because I finally understood I didn't owe him anything. Forgiveness wasn't an invitation to resume contact. It was a quiet decision made in the privacy of my own mind, one that freed me without offering him absolution. I owed myself closure more than I owed him explanation. On my 33rd birthday, Isla surprised me with a lemon tart and a candle I wasn't expecting. The whole office gathered for 10 minutes, singing off-key and clapping when I made a wish I didn't say out loud. My wish was simple: to keep this peace, to never go back to a life that asked me to shrink so someone else could shine. I spent the evening with new friends, drinking wine by the Thames and watching the city twinkle like it was proud of me. For the first time in years, I didn't check my phone. My mother called that night, her voice full of concern she hadn't voiced before. She'd heard from one of her book club friends that I was in Europe indefinitely, which was her way of asking why I hadn't come home. I told her as gently as I could that home had stopped being a location the moment I stopped being seen in it. She asked about Colton only once. I told her the truth. He was someone I used to love who didn't know how to love me back. You sound different, she said after a long pause. Better, but different. I told her I'd started sleeping through the night again, waking up without the ache of pretending. She didn't ask more after that. Mothers know when not to. The weeks rolled into months, and I began to forget the timeline of my old life. I couldn't tell you what month Daisy had first returned to London, or which Sunday Colton started wearing cologne again. The details blurred like watercolor in the rain, soft edges where once there were sharp lines. I remembered feelings more than facts, how my stomach used to knot every time his phone buzzed, how silence had begun to feel like a scream. Those memories no longer haunted me. They instructed me. I found a therapist in Soho, someone who understood the quiet violence of emotional betrayal. She listened without judgment, offering not just validation, but vocabulary. Gaslighting, emotional neglect, covert narcissism, words I hadn't dared attach to my experience now gave it shape. We didn't talk about revenge, we talked about recovery. We talked about how rebuilding starts with admitting what was broken. The flat began to fill slowly with pieces of the woman I was becoming. A velvet armchair in oxblood red. A framed map of London where I marked every place I'd explored alone. a stack of vintage postcards from Camden Market, each with a handwritten quote to myself on the back. "You're not hard to love, just hard to fool. You left. That means something." At work, I was promoted again, Director of Strategy for the entire EMEA region. The announcement came with applause, a bonus, and a glass of champagne in the office that I barely tasted because I was still shocked. Isla beamed like she'd always known this would happen, and maybe she had. She hugged me at the end of the day and whispered, "You make us all braver." I blinked back tears, not because I was sad, but because someone finally said what I needed to believe. One evening in March, I ran into James at a marketing summit, hosted in Kensington. He looked surprised to see me, but happy, in that reserved way old friends express when they're not sure if they're still allowed to be close. We caught up over mediocre canapes and overpriced wine. I told him about the flat, the job, the way London felt like a second skin now. He didn't mention Colton, and I didn't ask. Before we left, he handed me a business card for a publishing contact of his. "If you ever want to write this story," he said quietly, "not for them, for you." I nodded, pocketed the card, and walked into the London night with something that felt like a seed. Maybe I wasn't done telling the story. Maybe I was just beginning to tell it for myself. One Sunday morning, while sipping coffee near Hyde Park, I saw a couple that made me pause. They weren't particularly remarkable, mid-30s, laughing softly over a shared pastry, but there was something in the way he looked at her, like she was the only person who existed in that moment. I didn't envy them, but I remembered wanting to be looked at like that. I walked away before the jealousy could settle, reminding myself I wasn't loveless, just unentangled. There's a difference between loneliness and solitude, and I'd made peace with both. That night I journaled about it, writing, "I no longer wait to be chosen. I choose myself, every time." The next morning, I left the note on my vanity as a reminder. One afternoon in April, I received a small envelope in my office mailbox. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakably Daisy's. Inside was a single photograph. Me, in Richmond from behind. I recognized the coat I used to wear, the way my head tilted slightly when I walked alone. She'd taken it months ago, likely during one of her Sunday strolls through the life she was quietly replacing. No note, no explanation, just the photo. I didn't show it to anyone. I didn't need to. That picture, strange as it was, felt like an apology disguised as acknowledgement. She saw me. Not as competition, not as collateral damage, but as a woman walking alone through her own pain. I kept Daisy's photo tucked inside the back cover of my notebook, not because I needed it, but because it reminded me of how far I'd come. She hadn't written a caption or signed her name, but the message was there, clear, silent, and perhaps even remorseful. She'd seen me before I realized I was being watched, a quiet ghost in the background of her own reclamation. Now, we were both untethered from Colton, our stories diverging after a collision we never truly consented to. Maybe that was the closest either of us would get to peace. A week later, Isla arranged a team dinner to celebrate our latest campaign win, and we gathered at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the Thames. The table was full of laughter, clinking glasses, and stories that had nothing to do with betrayal or ex-wives. I sat between two colleagues who asked about my favorite places in the city, and I realized I had answers now, real ones, not just borrowed memories from someone else's preferences. London wasn't an escape anymore. It was home. I ordered dessert without guilt, choosing joy over control for the first time in years. That night, I walked home alone through streets bathed in amber light, my heels clicking against the pavement like punctuation marks. A street musician played something soft and mournful on a violin, and I paused to listen, letting the sound sink into my bones. I didn't check my phone, didn't reach for someone to fill the silence. I just stood there, letting music and air and the fact of my aloneness hold me like something sacred. That moment felt more intimate than most of my marriage. Colton hadn't tried to contact me again, not since the letter, and I didn't expect him to. Whatever realization he'd come to had either passed or hardened into something else. something less apologetic and more self-protective. He wouldn't apologize again, not really. Men like Colton believed regret was the same as growth, but I knew better now. Remorse without transformation is just sentimentality. I started writing in earnest that weekend, not for a publisher, not yet, but for myself. The story spilled out like water from a cracked pipe, sudden, unstoppable, messy. It wasn't a memoir, not exactly, but each scene echoed something real. The silences that followed Daisy's name, the warmth of a London morning untouched by betrayal, the sound of my own breathing in a quiet flat. I wrote the way I used to before marriage, before expectations, before I'd ever doubted my voice. For the first time in a long time, I didn't write to be understood. I wrote because I already understood myself. By May, the weather had turned, and with it, something in me softened. I bought a bicycle and began riding through Regent's Park on Sunday mornings, my old dread of weekends, slowly replaced by rituals that belonged only to me. I sipped coffee on park benches, journaled between meetings, even booked a solo day trip to Brighton, where I walked the pier and didn't once think about who might be texting someone else behind my back. There was a freedom in that kind of anonymity, in being no one's wife, no one's disappointment, no one's second choice. I was simply Paige, alive, present, unclaimed. One afternoon in early June, I received a LinkedIn message from a woman named Marissa, whom I didn't recognize. She said she was starting at Colton's firm, new to the London office, and had heard my name from back when you were Mrs. Hart. I stared at the screen for a long moment, the title scraping against something raw I thought had healed. Then I laughed, a quiet, incredulous sound that filled my empty office like a secret set free. I typed back politely, professionally, and left out everything that mattered. That night, I pulled out my old wedding album, for the first time since moving. The pictures had once felt like evidence of something sacred. Now they looked like artifacts from another lifetime. We were smiling, yes, but I could see it now. The way my fingers gripped his arm too tightly, the way his gaze drifted somewhere just off camera. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. Instead, I took out a pair of scissors and carefully cut myself out of each photo. I wasn't angry, just done. I placed the cutouts into an envelope labeled Before, then sealed the rest of the album into a box I'd never open again. Closure, in its purest form, isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing what you carry forward. And I chose not to carry a man who'd made me feel invisible. That weekend, I finally accepted Sarah's invitation to brunch. She'd apologized months ago, through a long, vulnerable email that acknowledged her dismissal of my pain, her blind allegiance to the illusion of adult maturity. I hadn't responded at the time, unsure of whether the wound could bear friendship again. But healing sometimes sounds like forgiveness, and I was ready to see if we could start over. She greeted me with cautious hope in her eyes, and a mimosa already waiting. We didn't talk about Colton right away. Instead, we spoke about her work, her sister's baby, the way we both secretly preferred croissants to kale. The air between us was less tense than I'd imagined. When we finally did address it, her words, her doubt, her failure to believe me, I let her speak without interruption. When she finished, I said, "Thank you," and meant it. She squeezed my hand across the table. "You're not who I thought you were," she said softly. "You're more." I smiled, unsure whether to accept it as praise or belated clarity. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe both were true. Later, walking home with a paper bag of pastries, I realized I wasn't just rebuilding. I was becoming someone I liked. Someone who didn't check other women's Instagram stories for signs of shared betrayal. Someone who didn't wait by the phone. Someone who walked forward without needing to look back. Before I narrate what happens next, kindly let me know why you haven't subscribed yet. The summer passed in soft focus, each day rolling into the next, with a kind of quiet grace I hadn't known I needed. I spent my evenings reading novels on the balcony, watering the potted lavender I'd grown fond of. Sometimes I'd fall asleep with the book still open, the breeze whispering through the cracked window like a lullaby. The nightmares stopped sometime in July, though I can't say when. I only noticed because one morning I woke up rested and realized I hadn't dreamt about him in weeks. I began volunteering at a women's center every other Saturday, helping with career mentorship for women transitioning out of difficult relationships. They didn't know my story, and I didn't offer it, but sometimes the way I paused before answering questions gave me away. One woman, Olivia, reminded me of myself, sharp, tired, always bracing for disappointment. She asked me once, "How do you know when it's really over?" And I answered, "When you stop checking if they're watching you walk away." Her smile in response felt like recognition. August arrived with heat and music festivals, and I let myself enjoy them both. I danced barefoot at Hyde Park with coworkers I barely knew, eating street food and letting strangers braid flowers into my hair. No one there cared who I used to be. I was just Paige, the woman who knew all the words to the song and wasn't afraid to sing them loud. It felt like a form of therapy I hadn't been prescribed. One morning while shopping at Columbia Road Flower Market, I spotted a familiar face across the crowd. It was Daisy, hair longer now, dress flowing like always, camera slung across her body like a weapon she knew how to use. Our eyes met for the briefest second, and she looked away first. She was with someone new, a man I didn't recognize, laughing at something he said while adjusting her strap. I turned in the opposite direction and kept walking. I didn't feel anger when I saw her, not even discomfort. If anything, I felt an odd sense of closure, like I'd watched the end of a film I no longer needed to rewatch. Whatever connection we once had through Colton had dissolved entirely. We were two strangers again, passing on a crowded street with no reason to stop. Later that afternoon, I met James for coffee at a cafe near Holborn. We hadn't seen each other in months, and it felt good to catch up without the heaviness of betrayal hovering between us. He asked how the writing was going, and I admitted I'd started turning my journal entries into a manuscript. "Fiction?" he asked. "Not exactly," I replied, stirring cream into my cup. He offered to introduce me to an editor friend, someone he trusted. I told him I'd think about it, not because I wasn't interested, but because I needed to be sure I was writing for the right reasons. Publishing a story was different than surviving one. It meant turning lived pain into something consumable. I wasn't sure yet if I was ready to let strangers read my scars. That night, I reread the first 5 chapters and realized I was proud of them. They weren't perfect, but they were honest. The main character's name wasn't Paige, but she shared my fear of vanishing inside someone else's idea of love. Her voice was sharper than mine had ever been in marriage, but the bones of her story were mine. I printed the pages and tucked them into a leather folder, the kind that felt weighty enough for something real. In September, I was invited to speak on a panel about women in leadership at a creative conference in Bristol. I stood in front of a room full of bright eyes and eager hands, talking about strategy and self-worth as if they were interchangeable concepts. Maybe they were. One woman asked, "What's the bravest decision you've made professionally?" And I answered, "To leave before I was asked to." The room went quiet, but several women nodded. After the panel, a young attendee named Mira approached me with teary eyes and a shaky voice. "I just ended a 5-year relationship with someone who said I was too ambitious," she said. I hugged her without hesitation, both of us holding on a second too long. "You're not too much," I whispered. "You were just in the wrong room." That night, I took a long bath in my hotel and thought about how many women were living my old life in different cities, different time zones, different marriages. I wondered if Colton ever stopped to think about what he lost. Not the wife who folded his socks or made dinner reservations, but the woman who would have walked through fire for him if he just asked her to walk beside him. That woman was gone now, and I didn't miss her. A few days later, I got an unexpected email from my old neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. She'd stumbled upon my article in a London business magazine, one that mentioned my move and leadership at the firm. Her message was short but sweet. "I knew you were too smart to stay small. The tulips you planted last autumn bloomed beautifully this spring. Come see them sometime." I read her words 3 times, heart-catching on the last sentence. I remembered the bulbs I'd buried like secrets, not knowing if I'd be there to witness their resurrection. Apparently, they'd thrived anyway, even without me. That felt symbolic. Things grow, even after you leave. I replied to Mrs. Patterson the next day, thanking her and promising to visit Richmond sometime before winter. I didn't know if I actually would, but it felt kind to say it. The idea of walking past that old townhouse made my chest tighten, even now. I wasn't afraid of running into Colton. I was afraid of remembering how hard I'd tried to keep us alive. That kind of memory didn't wound. It hollowed. October crept in with brisk mornings and soft scarves, and my evenings shifted from walks to writing. I lit candles scented like cedar and inked chapters in quiet, letting the story unfold as it wanted. By then, the manuscript had a title, twice chosen. I wasn't sure if it was for the character or for me, but it stuck. James's editor friend Rachel read the first 50 pages and emailed me within 2 days. Her message was full of praise, but not fluff. "Your story doesn't shout, and that's what makes it dangerous," she wrote. "Let's talk about what comes next." We scheduled a meeting for the following Tuesday, and I spent the weekend prepping, nervous in a way I hadn't been since my first pitch deck. This wasn't just business, it was voice, and I wasn't hiding behind PowerPoints anymore. Rachel was younger than I expected, early 30s, sharp eyes and blunt edges softened only by her oversized jumper. She read with the intensity of someone who didn't just want stories. She wanted proof they mattered. Over oat milk lattes in a quiet bookstore cafe, we discussed structure, tone, and how much of the ending I wanted to fictionalize. "You don't need to protect him," she said gently. "He's already made his choices." I blinked at her for a second, surprised. I hadn't told her anything specific about Colton, just described the ex-husband character as someone who forgot what loyalty looked like. But somehow, she knew. Maybe it was the precision of my scenes, or the way the protagonist never cried over the same man twice. Or maybe, as women, we just recognize certain stories when we hear them, whether spoken or not. The book deal wasn't official, but it was likely, and I let myself celebrate in my own quiet way. A new leather journal. A bottle of champagne I opened alone and drank while watching Notting Hill on my sofa, quoting the lines out loud just because I could. No one rolled their eyes or told me I was being dramatic. No one checked their phone while I talked. I toasted the version of me who'd once believed she needed someone to feel like she was enough. By mid-October, the leaves in Shoreditch turned to gold and rust, and I wore wool coats again. The city was even more beautiful in the chill, like it shed summer's softness to reveal its edges. I liked it better that way. I knew something about loving with edges now. And I'd stopped being afraid of them. I walked to work past a bakery that made the best pain au chocolat I'd ever tasted, and the barista knew my name. That mattered more than I thought it would. Some days, Isla would walk in with 2 coffees and news about someone in our department getting promoted. "Everyone's watching you," she said once, in the best way. I didn't ask about Colton anymore, not even through mutual friends. I assumed he still lived in Clapham, maybe still circling the same conversations with women who hadn't yet realized how many ways silence could betray you. Maybe Daisy was still photographing ghosts in places that used to belong to someone else. Maybe she wasn't. I didn't care enough to find out. In early November, Sarah invited me to her sister's baby shower in Hampstead, and for the first time I said yes to a gathering that included strangers who knew my former life. I dressed in soft neutrals, wore the pearl earrings my grandmother left me, and brought a handmade baby blanket I'd ordered from a local artisan. The women there asked polite questions about work, about London, about how I knew Sarah. No one asked about Colton. That silence was its own form of grace. As the afternoon faded, I stepped outside for air, nursing a lemonade and watching leaves fall like slow rain. Sarah followed a moment later, her expression unreadable. "He reached out, you know," she said softly. "Colton. A few weeks ago." I didn't respond right away. "He asked if I'd spoken to you," she continued. "Said he was thinking about writing to you again, but didn't want to intrude." I smiled at that. Colton, the master of intrusion, pretending to worry about boundaries. "Did you tell him anything?" I asked, more curious than concerned. Sarah shook her head. "Just that you're doing well, and that you don't need saving." I placed my glass on the railing and looked at the street below. "That's the truth," I said. "I saved myself." She nodded, and we stood in silence for a while, two women on a balcony where nothing needed fixing. The wind was sharp but not cruel. I didn't shiver. That night, I walked home through Hampstead Heath, past houses with lights glowing from their front rooms. I imagined dinners happening behind those windows, soft conversations over wine and roasted vegetables, children laughing in pajamas. Once I'd thought that was the only version of happiness worth chasing. Now I knew better. There was also happiness in walking home alone and not wishing someone was walking with you. The first frost of winter arrived like a whisper, dusting the city in silver and pressing itself against my windows each morning. I wore gloves to work and drank hot chai instead of espresso, savoring the heat that lingered in my palms. My manuscript was nearly complete, and Rachel had already begun sharing it with early readers. Every chapter felt like shedding a layer of skin I no longer needed, a kind of emotional exfoliation that left me raw but freer. I wasn't writing to hurt anyone. I was writing to understand who I'd been and who I never wanted to be again. December brought soft lights and quiet magic to London, wreaths on doors, twinkling displays in shop windows, buskers singing carols with tinny keyboards and woolen hats. At work, the pace slowed just enough to allow breath between meetings, and holiday cards began arriving in tidy stacks. I sent one to my mother, another to Mrs. Patterson, and a third to Sarah, thanking her for the version of herself that showed up this year. I didn't send one to Colton, even though I considered it for a full 3 minutes. The thought passed quickly, like a cold draft under a closed door, noticeable but not dangerous. One rainy afternoon, Rachel called with the kind of energy that meant news. "3 publishers want meetings," she said, nearly out of breath, "and one's already prepared to make an offer." I leaned against my kitchen counter, heart thudding like it used to before big presentations. But this wasn't work. It was me, distilled into paper and ink and chapters that bled with honesty. I signed the contract by the end of the week. The publisher, a woman-owned imprint based in East London, loved the book not for its drama, but for its quiet refusal to apologize. "There's power in restraint," the editor had said during our meeting. "You didn't burn the house down. You just walked out and left the matchbook behind." I smiled then, not because I felt powerful, but because I finally felt understood. That was the kind of power I could live with. To celebrate, I invited a small group to my flat, just 6 people, all of whom knew me post-Colton. We drank Prosecco, ordered Indian food, and danced in our socks to Fleetwood Mac until someone knocked over a candle and we burst into laughter. No one brought up husbands, or heartbreak, or Daisy. That part of my story didn't belong here anymore. And no one missed it. The next morning I walked through the quiet city, scarf wrapped tight, cheeks pink from the chill. London was peaceful in the early hours, still dozing under fog and promise. I stopped at a bakery for a croissant and took it to the park, sitting on a damp bench that didn't mind my presence. Across the path, a golden retriever chased a pigeon with clumsy joy, its owner laughing softly and jogging behind. I smiled at the dog, grateful there were still things in this world that ran just for the fun of it. That night, I received a text from an unknown number. "I saw a preview of your book. Congratulations. Really, Daisy." I stared at the message for a long time, wondering how she'd gotten my number and whether it mattered. I typed a simple response, "Thank you," and nothing more. There was nothing else to say. The story had already been told, and neither of us could rewrite it now. Winter deepened, and with it came a kind of stillness I'd earned. No more searching through receipts for proof. No more listening for lies between words. No more waking up wondering whether I was someone's second choice. I'd stopped fighting ghosts. My publisher set a release date for spring and sent a draft of the cover, a watercolor skyline behind a woman walking away, her figure small but steady. It made me cry. Not because it was sad, but because someone had captured what I felt without needing me to explain it. I hung a copy of the design beside my desk. Some stories deserved a frame. One Saturday in late January, I ran into Isla at a vintage market in Camden. She waved me over from a stall selling second-hand typewriters, grinning like she'd just found treasure. "Look at this," she said, holding up a scarf in the exact shade of mustard I once told her reminded me of optimism. We bought pastries and sat on a low wall to eat them, our breath clouding the air. "When your book comes out," she said between bites, "you're going to help so many people." I didn't know if that was true, but I hoped it might be. Not because I wanted to be a savior, just because I wanted someone else to feel less alone. I'd once needed a story that told me I wasn't crazy for noticing everything. I'd needed a voice that didn't tell me to wait for change, but to become the change. Now I could be that voice for someone else. One afternoon in February, I visited a bookshop near Notting Hill that carried early proofs of new titles. I found mine on a back table, nestled between novels about reinvention and memoirs about loss. I picked it up, ran my fingers over the mat cover, and smiled. No one else in the shop knew what I was holding. But I did. That night, I lit a candle and reread the last chapter. Not to edit, but to remember. The final line read, "She didn't leave to hurt anyone. She left to finally love herself." I hadn't changed it since I wrote it, because it still felt like the most honest sentence I'd ever written. I closed the document, closed the laptop, and let the silence of my flat wrap around me like a blanket I'd sewn with my own hands. The book launched on a quiet Tuesday in March, with little fanfare and a single bouquet from my editor that smelled like eucalyptus and ink. I went to work like it was any other day, nodding politely when Isla placed a copy of it on my desk, like a secret we both knew how to keep. I didn't post about it immediately, didn't shout into the void of social media or stage an artificial celebration. Instead, I walked home after dark and passed a small independent bookstore that had placed it in their front window. Seeing it there, among titles written by women who taught me how to survive, I felt like I'd joined a lineage of quiet rebellions. By the end of the week, the first reviews trickled in, soft praise wrapped in paragraphs that felt like recognition. One called it a love letter to the woman you were before you forgot how to want things. Another said, "It doesn't scream, it lingers." I screenshotted the lines, saved them in a folder titled "Keep for Rainy Days," and closed my laptop without crying. Sarah hosted a small book brunch at her flat the following weekend, inviting a few mutual friends I hadn't seen since the Richmond days. I almost declined, but curiosity won out over caution. Most of them knew what had happened, though only in fragments. Sarah had never shared the whole story, and I hadn't corrected any assumptions. They asked polite questions and gave me genuine compliments, and no one asked about Colton. That silence, again, felt like kindness. Afterward, as we cleared dishes and poured more coffee, one of the women, Mary Ann maybe, asked if I missed the old version of my life. I paused, then told her the truth. I don't miss being misunderstood. It wasn't the answer she expected, but she nodded slowly, like she understood more than she could say. We didn't talk about husbands or endings after that. We talked about gardens and the price of oat milk, and where to find good coats on a budget. That night, I found myself rereading the email Colton had sent months earlier, the one I'd never replied to, the one that used the word regret like a band-aid for a wound he hadn't even acknowledged. It didn't hurt to read it now. It felt distant, like reading someone else's story or watching an old movie where you already know how the heartbreak unfolds. I deleted it without ceremony. I didn't need it anymore. Spring arrived slowly, but surely. Daffodils bloomed in sidewalk cracks, and the daylight stretched longer into the evenings like an invitation to stay outside. I started taking my lunch breaks in the park near my office, sharing benches with pigeons and people on their own versions of escape. One afternoon, a stranger complimented my book after seeing the copy beside my sandwich. She didn't recognize me at first, not until she caught the name on my ID badge. Her eyes widened, but her voice stayed calm. "I read that in one sitting," she said. It felt like someone finally put my thoughts into order. I thanked her with a smile that reached my eyes, and didn't apologize for the tears that followed. She didn't ask questions, just handed me her napkin like an offering, and returned to her lunch. We didn't exchange names. It was better that way. In late April, I received a small package at my flat. No return address, but the handwriting was familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. I opened it slowly, careful with the tape, unsure what to expect. Inside was a book, my book, with 5 sentences underlined in pencil. A note was tucked in the cover. I finally understand. I hope you're free now. See, I didn't keep the note, but I didn't throw it away either. Instead, I folded it into the pages of a blank journal and wrote beneath it, "Understanding doesn't undo harm." That was the truth I needed to remember. Apologies, even quiet ones, couldn't reconstruct what had already been dismantled. I didn't hate him. I just didn't belong in the same story anymore. As the book reached more readers, I started getting messages from women who wanted to share their own stories. Long emails, sometimes scattered, sometimes poetic, always brave. They told me about marriages that felt like negotiations, about silences that bruised louder than screams, about finally choosing themselves even when it cost them everything they thought they'd earned. I read every word. I replied to as many as I could. I reminded them that leaving wasn't failure, it was permission. May came warm and golden, and I took a solo trip to the Lake District, where I stayed in a stone cottage that smelled like thyme and sunlight. I left my phone off for 3 days, hiked in borrowed boots, and let the stillness reset something in me. At night, I wrote by candlelight and listened to the rain tap against the window like a song that only existed for me. I didn't miss the city. I didn't miss anyone. The final version of my book hit shelves nationwide, just as tulips began blooming across London again, red and yellow and pink, pushing up through earth that had once held secrets. I passed Mrs. Patterson's house one Sunday and saw the garden full and wild. I didn't knock, but I lingered at the gate for a while, smiling at the life I used to live and the one I had chosen instead. Everything was growing again, including me. The day Twice Chosen hit the bestseller list, I was grocery shopping in a jumper 2 sizes too big, and boots still damp from the morning rain. Isla called me screaming, her voice high-pitched and full of disbelief, and I nearly dropped a carton of eggs in the aisle. "You're number 7, she shouted, and for a moment I couldn't remember what that meant. When I did, I leaned against the shopping trolley and let myself laugh until people started staring. It felt surreal that something born out of my most private undoing was now living on shelves in cities I'd never even visited. That night, I toasted myself with a glass of white wine and leftover risotto, sitting cross-legged on my couch while emails from press teams poured in. Rachel wanted interviews lined up for radio, print, podcasts, and everything in between. I agreed to most of them but asked that no questions focus on Colton or on Daisy or on anyone but me. "The book is about choosing myself," I said. "Let's not dilute that by centering the people I had to walk away from." The interviews came in waves, some curious, some too rehearsed, but most respectful in a way that made me feel safe. One host asked if the woman in the book had forgiven the man who betrayed her. I paused before answering, careful with my words. "She forgave him the moment she stopped needing anything from him," I said. "Forgiveness isn't always about letting someone back in. It's about letting yourself move on without dragging their shadow behind you." Emails from readers began piling up again, some thanking me, some confessing things they'd never said aloud, even to their therapists. I kept every one, even the messy ones written at 3 a.m. in all lowercase, full of typos and heartbreak. They reminded me of the woman I'd once been, searching, unraveling, half convinced she was imagining the red flags that now flew like banners in hindsight. One reader wrote, "Your book gave me language for something I've been feeling for years but didn't know how to name." I printed that one and taped it inside my wardrobe door, just above my favorite coat. By June, Twice Chosen had been translated into 4 languages, and my publisher sent me the covers for the French and Italian editions. Seeing my name beneath words I didn't understand made it feel more real somehow. My life had become bigger than the apartment I'd cried in, the garden path I'd paced while Colton lied on the phone, or the Richmond kitchen where I'd whispered okay to things I should have screamed at. Now my words traveled where I hadn't. They spoke on my behalf. One morning, as I passed a newsstand in King's Cross, I saw a magazine with my face on the cover. It was an arts feature titled, "How Paige Hart Rewrote the Rules of Leaving." The photo was one Rachel had insisted I take, soft lighting, no makeup, Just me in a gray sweater and my grandmother's pearl earrings. I bought 5 copies. Not out of vanity, but because I wanted to remember how far I'd come. That weekend I visited Brighton again. The same pier, the same salty air, the same carousel turning in slow circles like time didn't matter. But this time I wasn't running from anything. I strolled with a purpose, bought myself fresh flowers from a seaside stall, and wrote postcards to people who had held space for me. We bloom when we stop begging for light. I wrote on one. I mailed it to myself. In July, Rachel invited me to speak at a summer literary festival in Edinburgh, and I said yes before she finished the sentence. The train ride up felt cinematic, rolling hills, misted windows, my manuscript beside me like an old friend. When I arrived, the green of Scotland hit me like a benediction, rich and alive. The audience was warm, mostly women, mostly quiet. I spoke with a calm I hadn't known I could access. After the panel, a woman approached with hesitant eyes and said, "I left him last week." I took her hand without asking her name. "You're right on time," I said. "Not late, not broken, just starting." She wept into my shoulder, and I let her, because I knew what that kind of relief felt like. Back in London, I received a letter, handwritten again, the same careful scrawl I hadn't seen since winter. No return address. But this one was longer, more uncertain. It wasn't an apology, it was a farewell. Colton wrote, "I saw you on the magazine. You looked peaceful, and it wrecked me a little because I never gave you peace when I should have." I don't expect a reply. I just wanted you to know that when I think of you now, I don't see the woman who left. I see the one who stayed too long. I hope you never do that again for anyone. Not even me. I didn't reply, but I didn't resent it. In its own way, the letter was a cracked window in a house I'd long since walked out of. I let the breeze through, then closed it again. It was enough to know he'd finally seen what I had always been offering. By the end of summer, I signed a second book deal, fiction this time. It wouldn't be about Colton. It wouldn't even be about me. But it would carry the fingerprints of a woman who once chose silence and now chose story. I'd found my voice, and I wasn't afraid of using it anymore. The second book came easier than I expected, not because the writing was simple, but because I didn't flinch while doing it. It was fiction, yes, but the truth still lived in the rhythm of the sentences, in the way the main character hesitated before saying yes, in the way she walked into her new life without looking over her shoulder. My editor said the prose felt braver, more expansive, like someone who no longer wrote to survive but to shape the world she wanted to live in. I told her that's exactly what I was doing. She nodded, and we didn't need to say more. I spent the rest of the summer in rhythms I never wanted to end. Coffee before sunrise, calls with foreign publishers in languages I couldn't speak, early morning walks in neighborhoods that no longer reminded me of anything except myself. Sarah and I became something better than friends. We became honest. She no longer tried to fix things, and I no longer needed her to explain herself. When I told her the new book wouldn't mention Colton at all, she smiled and said, "That's how you know it's really over." She was right. In August, I received an invitation to speak at a university creative writing program. I stood in front of 30 women in their 20s, all of them waiting to hear how to be brave. I told them the truth. Sometimes bravery doesn't look like fighting. It looks like walking away so quietly, no one hears the door close until it's already locked. One asked, "How do you know when it's time to leave?" And I answered, "When staying requires you to disappear." No one spoke after that for a long moment. The first copies of my second book arrived in early September, wrapped in brown paper and string like something from a time before betrayal had barcodes. I opened the box alone, just like I had with the first, but this time the silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like celebration. I ran my hand across the cover, heart steady, not racing. There was no fear in this story, only freedom. James called to congratulate me, and we met for dinner in Marylebone at a restaurant with candles that flickered like memory. He asked if I'd heard from Colton again, and I told him no, and that I didn't expect to. "He's a chapter I already finished," I said, stirring the rim of my glass. "Some people aren't meant to be read twice. James lifted his drink like a toast and said, "Then may your next chapters be full of people who know how to stay." Fall arrived with the smell of rain on pavement and the soft rustle of scarves pulled tighter around collars. My publisher planned a modest launch event at a gallery in Soho, where readers wandered among photographs while I signed pages and smiled until my cheeks ached. Daisy wasn't there, though part of me wondered if she'd come, just to see how the story ended. But she didn't, and maybe that was a gift in itself. Not all mirrors need to be held up again. Mrs. Patterson sent me another email around that time. Short, sweet, full of updates about the tulips, the neighborhood, the new couple who'd bought my old house. She said the new owners repainted the front door a pale blue and put wind chimes in the garden. I didn't feel lost when I read it. I felt gratitude that someone else was making memories in a place I'd outgrown. Some houses aren't homes forever. They're just places we survive before becoming someone else. The reviews for the second book were even stronger than the first. Critics called it graceful, unflinching, emotionally precise. One said, "Paige Hart has the rare ability to say what other people don't dare to feel." I printed that line and kept it in my kitchen, right beside a photo I took of my feet on a rainy sidewalk the day I left Richmond. Every morning I passed it on my way to make tea. It reminded me where everything started. At a book club event in October, a woman in her 60s approached me with tears in her eyes and a copy of Twice Chosen covered in highlighted passages. "I thought I was too old to begin again," she said. "But your book convinced me I wasn't." I held her hands and said the only thing that mattered: "You never are." She cried, I cried, and the room gave us space to do so. Healing doesn't care about age. My mother visited London in November, her first trip overseas since I moved. She stayed for 6 days, sleeping on the pullout in my study and commenting on how much softer my voice sounded now. "You seem taller," she said one morning while we walked along the Thames. "Not physically, just taller in the way you carry yourself." I told her I'd finally stopped trying to fit into a life that wasn't stitched for me. She asked about Colton only once, on our last night together, over a bowl of soup and candlelight. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you stayed?" I shook my head. Not anymore. I used to wonder what would have happened if he'd chosen me, but now I realize I was always the one who had to choose. On the anniversary of the day I left, I didn't mark it with sadness. I didn't revisit the photos, or the emails, or the texts that once lit up my phone like warnings I refused to read. Instead, I took myself to dinner at a small restaurant tucked between two bookstores, where no one knew my name and the waiter called me Love in the way only Londoners can. I ordered exactly what I wanted, drank exactly as much as I liked, and left a generous tip. That was my celebration. Quiet, certain, and mine alone. When I walked home that night, the city glowed gold and silver around me, and I realized there was no version of my old life I missed. The woman who stayed had become the woman who left, and the woman who left had become the woman who finally arrived. Not in someone's arms, not in a grand romance, but in herself. And she was enough. She always had been. Thank you for listening to Paige's story. If you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so before watching another story on the channel.